In the early 20th century, Cleveland rode the wave of industrialization to become America's sixth largest city, with its population surging from 160,000 to 900,000. But after the Great Depression of 1929, this city, so heavily dependent on heavy industry, was hit devastatingly hard. Unemployment soared past 30%, and most of those 900,000 residents found themselves plunged into economic ruin, losing their homes because they couldn't pay mortgages or rent. It was in this context that Kingsbury Run, a valley cutting through Cleveland's east side, became crowded with shantytowns built by the unemployed. It was a forgotten place, where the homeless slept under abandoned railway bridges, the jobless spent nights in freight cars, and prostitutes received clients in dim alleyways. And then came the Cleveland torso murderer. From 1934 to 1938, with chilling anatomical precision, he dismembered and decapitated his victims, casually tossing their torsos and severed limbs along the overgrown riverbanks. At least 13 people were killed, 7 men and 6 women. Criminologists called them the less dead, those whose deaths wouldn't draw society's attention. A historian later said that Kingsbury Run wasn't just a geographical valley, but a graveyard for the American dream, where people who had believed industrial cities would bring them a better life ended up losing their heads, their identities, even every trace of their existence. Eliot Ness, the legendary prohibition agent famous for taking down Chicago gangsters, especially Al Capone, took on the case and launched a massive investigation. He even illegally detained a surgeon and interrogated him secretly in a hotel room. But this case became the biggest stain on his career. Not only did he damage the public interest, but the killer deliberately placed 2 victims' remains near Cleveland City Hall, within direct sight of his office window, and he never solved it. The torso killer's first victim was known as the Lady of the Lake, the most mysterious opening act of the case, and the very beginning of this string of murders. In September 1934, a man was taking his usual walk along the shore of Lake Erie when he came across a woman's body washed up on the beach. Or rather, what was left of her, just the lower half from waist to knee, both legs severed at the knees. The Cuyahoga County coroner, after conducting the autopsy, noted that the victim had died roughly 6 months prior, and her torso had been in the water for about 3 or 4 months. Possibly to slow the stench of decomposition, the killer had applied some kind of chemical preservative to her skin, leaving it red, tough, and leathery to the touch. What stood out was a distinctive mark on her abdomen, a surgical scar. So Cleveland police went through dozens of missing women reports from the past 6 months, but nobody matched that description of a scar on the abdomen. The torso killer was also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, and from this nickname alone it can tell the damage he inflicted on the place was impossible to ignore. In the Great Depression, Kingsbury Run was Cleveland's dark underbelly, where all manner of the unemployed, the homeless, the cast-offs of society had gathered. For the torso killer, this was his hunting ground. People came and went constantly, and the homeless people vanishing wouldn't raise a single eyebrow. A year after the Lady of the Lake was found, in September 1935, 2 teenage boys stumbled upon a naked male body at the foot of a hill in Kingsbury Run. His head was gone, his genitals cut off. The coroner determined the cause of death was decapitation. Fingerprint comparison later confirmed his identity. Edward Ondraschi, a 28-year-old white man who frequented a bar called the Roaring Third. Edward was the first victim to be identified, and in that sense, he was luckier than most. He wasn't one of the nameless souls of Kingsbury Run. The world had known him while he was alive. But the police search didn't end there. Near the same scene, they found a second body, another white male, around 40 years old, also decapitated, also castrated, his skin coated with that same chemical preservative that had turned the Lady of the Lake's skin red and hard and leathery. And despite years of trying, this victim was never identified. Then came January 1936. A female worker, on her way home from her shift, spotted 2 baskets sitting beside a factory. They were wrapped tightly in newspaper. She took a look inside, and her scream brought the whole street running. Inside were the dismembered remains of a woman, decapitated like the others. Fingerprint analysis gave them a name: Florence Palello, a waitress who occasionally worked as a bar hostess. She had lived just a few blocks from the Roaring Third. In June 1936, a morning in Kingsbury Run, two young boys found a human head wrapped inside a pair of trousers. The next day, Cleveland police located the rest of the body, a man in his 20s. He had 6 tattoos on his body. Since no one ever came forward to claim him, he became known as the Tattooed Man. Later, Cleveland police put a plaster cast of his head on display, alongside a chart of his tattoos. Over 100,000 people lined up to see it. Some took photos, others whispered among themselves. The Tattooed Man still has no name today, and that original plaster mask, along with 3 others, hangs on the wall of the Cleveland Police Museum to this day. In July 1936, a teenage girl was cutting through the woods on Cleveland's near west side when she found a head near Clinton Road and Big Creek. It belonged to a white man in his 40s, dead for about 2 months. The coroner later determined this was the primary crime scene because there was simply too much blood. Given the victim's unkempt hair, shabby clothes, and the proximity to a homeless encampment, he was presumed to be a vagrant. But his body was too decomposed to take fingerprints, and his identity remains unknown. September 1936, back in Kingsbury Run, a homeless man was trying to hop a slow-moving freight train when, running through the weeds along the embankment, he tripped over a man's body. No head, no legs, just the upper half of a torso. Cleveland police later found the lower half of the torso and both legs in an exposed sewer nearby. The coroner noted the victim was nearly 30 and that he had been decapitated while still alive. In February 1937, on the shore east of Bratenahl, almost exactly where the Lady of the Lake had been found, another woman's upper torso washed up. 2 women, the same stretch of shoreline. It was this pattern that finally confirmed the Lady of the Lake as the Cleveland torso killer's very first victim. In June 1937, the 8th victim turned up. A rotting sack containing newspapers from June 1936 and partial female remains that had been dead for about a year. At first, she was identified as a missing prostitute named Rose Wallace. Police chased this lead, checked Rose's dental records, talked to her neighbors, and came up with absolutely nothing. Rose had vanished, and whether the woman in the sack was her, the authorities never said. That summer of 1937, labor disputes in the Flats district had gotten out of hand, and the National Guard moved in to keep order. One young guardsman was stationed on a bridge on the west side late at night when a tugboat passed underneath. A piece of human remains surfaced in its wake. Over the next few days, police dragged the river and recovered everything except the head. The coroner's examination revealed something even more horrifying this time. The killer hadn't just decapitated the victim, he'd hollowed out the abdominal cavity and taken the heart with him. In April 1938, a young worker was walking along the bank of the Cuyahoga River, heading to his morning shift in the Flats. Something was floating on the water. At first he thought it was a dead fish, but as he got closer, he realized it was a woman's leg, severed below the knee. It wasn't until a month later that Cleveland police pulled 2 sacks from the river and finally pieced together most of this female victim's remains. August 16, 1938. 3 junk collectors were rummaging through a dump, looking for anything they could sell, when they pulled aside a pile of rotting cardboard boxes and saw a man's double-breasted blue suit jacket. Inside was a woman's torso. Nearby lay a box wrapped in brown butcher paper, containing her legs, her arms, and her head. While Cleveland police were expanding their search of the area, they found a second body just yards away. This place was only a few streets from Ness's office, close enough to see from his window. It was as if the torso killer had left it there to mock him. By the time, after Prohibition was repealed, the legendary lawman, Eliot Ness, had seen his special task force disbanded and himself reassigned to alcohol tax enforcement. Then he got an invitation from Cleveland Mayor Burton to come to Cleveland with the title of Public Safety Director, overseeing police, fire, the entire city's public safety apparatus. What Burton needed from him was reform, cleaning up a corrupt police force, rooting out the rot. But by 1936, While he was busy ousting corrupt sheriffs and reorganizing the department, the torso killer had already claimed 6 victims. The press had gone absolutely wild. The Cleveland Press, the Cleveland News, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, all 3 running daily stories on the murders and suspects. Who was the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run? The question was practically staring the public in the face. Burton's pressure kept mounting. He needed an answer, a scapegoat. He needed this case to end on his watch. So he thrust Ness into the spotlight, and Ness was forced to transform from a city reformer into a hunter chasing the torso killer. August 18th, just 2 days after those 2 new victims were found. In the early morning hours, Ness led 35 police officers and detectives in a raid on the largest homeless encampment in Kingsbury Run. His team pushed through from north to south, searching every corner, and in the end they found nothing. No killer, no murder weapon, not a shred of evidence pointing to the Mad Butcher. So, after arresting 63 people, Ness stood there on the riverbank, looked at those crooked shanties, and ordered them burned to the ground. The next day, the press tore him apart. The Chicago hero had become, in their eyes, an arsonist, a tyrant. Most of those 63 so-called suspects were released the very next day. Ness had arrested them without any legitimate grounds for detention, and he'd burned down the homes of thousands of homeless people. By this point, frankly, Ness was reeling from public backlash and the crushing pressure of being forced to solve the torso killer case. Not long after, Ness illegally arrested a man named Francis Sweeney. Francis was a surgeon with a history of alcoholism and drug abuse, and he possessed the professional anatomical knowledge the coroner had described. In a hotel room, Ness administered 2 polygraph tests to Francis. He failed both. The polygraph expert told Ness that Francis was their man, but Ness never charged him because Francis had a cousin, Martin, who was a U.S. congressman, Ness's political enemy, no less, and had publicly demanded to know when Ness would finally catch the killer. Charging the cousin of a congressman, an unstable doctor with war trauma and alcohol dependency, would have been virtually impossible to make stick. Later, Francis voluntarily committed himself to a veterans hospital where he would regularly send threatening postcards to Ness and his family. Whether Francis was actually the killer is hard to say with any certainty. All the evidence was circumstantial. But once he was institutionalized, the murders stopped. In 1929, Francis had been a surgical resident at St. Alexis Hospital, right near Kingsbury Run. He'd rented an office there, right next to the coroner's morgue. Clean, private, with an autopsy table. A man named Emil Fronek had even filed a police report in 1934 saying a doctor had tried to drug him, and the location he described was right near Francis's office. As a surgeon, Francis had access to the drugs, and when sober, he had the skill to handle those victims like surgical specimens. As for whether he had alibis, no concrete information was ever released. Maybe Francis was the closest Ness ever got to an answer, but he was too desperate to close the case, and too wary of Francis's cousin's political clout. He couldn't bring himself to arrest Francis publicly. Then there was another suspect. In July 1939, a county sheriff named Martin arrested 52-year-old Frank, charging him with Polilo's murder. She had lived with him for a while, and Frank had also been connected to Edward and Rose. At first, Frank confessed to killing Polillo. Then he recanted, claiming police had beaten the confession out of him. Not long after, Frank was found dead in his cell at Cuyahoga County Jail. Official cause, suicide by hanging. But when the coroner examined Frank's body, he found 6 broken ribs, all fractured during his time in custody. Clearly, Frank was almost certainly not the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. He looked far more like a scapegoat, a sacrificial lamb trotted out so the police could announce a breakthrough in the newspapers. In the end, the Cleveland torso killer remains one of the most baffling cases in American criminal history. And here's what makes it even more haunting. Virtually all the official records, thousands of interview transcripts, autopsy photographs, fingerprint cards, suspect files were lost, destroyed, or simply erased.